This video is a follow-up I did to a video last year titled Heathers a Relevant Classic. Quite a few people have asked what my thoughts were on Heathers the Musical, a later adaptation created by Lawrence O'Keefe and Kevin Murphy. I've hesitated doing a video discussing this for a few reasons. The first is, I used to have a really bad computer. That's fixed now. The second is that I'm well aware of how many people like this adaptation, with many people thinking it's superior to the original film. This is in contrast to my opinion that this is a very poor adaptation that misses many of the key points the original is going for. Now, saying that, I'll need to clarify that I don't dislike the musical purely because it's different. I've been a fan of many adaptations that radically change a work in the past. For example, the film adaptation of The Prisoner of Azkaban compresses quite a few scenes together and adds in specific moments that reinforce what the movie specifically is going for. I have similar feelings towards adaptations that are far more broad strokes than even that, because I feel they have compelling narratives in their own right. No, my problem with the musical is that both in contrast to the original film and just by itself, it's an inconsistent mess, and let's go through why. Part 1. Tone and Satire. At its core, satire is a framework for critique that uses controversial or provocative elements in order to say something, from simple observations to political statements. If you wanted to critique capitalism using satire, for example, one good way to do that is to accentuate qualities of it that already exist, and have a narrative constructed around someone realizing the underlying cynical nature of it. They Live, a rather popular satirical work, has the main character literally get a pair of glasses that does this for him. Phantom of the Paradise, a 1974 rock opera film by Brian De Palma, does this by using the three main characters as metaphors for positions in the music industry, and the hierarchies associated with that. This is done to highlight the destruction of the music writer Winslow, using the framework of Phantom of the Opera and the story of Faust to show how exploitation is perpetuated and what it leads to. Now, this can start to get very complicated once you factor in people create satire of other satirical works, or heck, use edginess to combat other edginess. To keep it simple, I'll go ahead and reduce good satire, something that uses a topic in order to deconstruct it, and if it doesn't meaningfully deconstruct the topic, it fails as satire. The movie Jack and Jill would be a great example of how this can fail. Towards the end of the film, Al Pacino, played by Al Pacino, advertises the fictional Dunkachino, and he expresses distaste of the final product afterwards.
All copies. Destroy them.
So there is a statement being made here that is against the thing it's satirizing. Seems fine so far, until you account for the rest of the narrative and the blatant amounts of product placement throughout the work that is not meaningfully critiqued. Jill being on The Price is Right doesn't critique the show itself so much as it's just the family getting up to wacky hijinks on a Royal Caribbean cruise does not meaningfully critique it, it endorses it as a fun time. You see my point. To meaningfully critique something, you can't revel in it for most of the text and then have a stinger at the end finally having some commentary. It's not using satire for critique so much as a cover to abscond from its own consumerism. The second most important aspect of satire would be the tone being conveyed during it. You know, is it being irreverent, is it being sarcastic, dark, comedic, etc. This tone can vary moment by moment, but as long as it's clear that there is something being critiqued, it'll work. Let's use the movie version of Heathers for this example. When Veronica and Heather Chandler go to the Remington University party, the score is reinforcing the dark, dreamlike tone of the party that neither of them particularly want to be in. As Veronica angrily narrates the events, we see how Heather is used by the people at the party, and how Veronica rebukes attempts to conform. This ends with her and Heather ideologically contrasting with something that fundamentally they agree makes them feel like garbage. Now looking at Heathers the Musical, this is where we can start to understand its first problem. The musical is extremely inconsistent when and where it applies meaningful critique, and will oftentimes obfuscate or remove commentary that was very clear in the original. The closest equivalent to the Remington party, the big fun sequence, glorifies all the things that the film was critical of. Instead of Veronica trying to stay as far out of the party as possible, she's in the thick of it talking about how awesome doing drugs and being hit on is.
Veronica, you are looking good tonight!
I just want to get laid.
You don't deserve my f***ing speech.
It does get appropriately dark once Veronica rejects her treatment of Martha Dunstock, but then immediately moves into Veronica, let me see, breaking into JD's house and having sex with him, with the show making it clear that she was a virgin before this.
You were my first.
Guess we gotta talk about that, huh? Part 2, Veronica. If I were to describe Veronica's character in the movie, it'd be an apathetic person trapped in a social hierarchy who delves further into nihilism under the influence of a toxic relationship. Before breaking out and working towards fixing the damage both that relationship and the hierarchy she was involved in caused and is causing. On the surface, Veronica's character in the musical would fit into that same mold. But while she does have a similar arc and it does end with Veronica stopping JD from blowing up the school, a large swath of details were changed both to facilitate more songs and to make her a more relatable character. This starts as early as the opening, which shows how Veronica joined the clique in the first place and how she betrayed her friend in the process. This is a very radical change in framework from how she started in the original, which never explains how she becomes part of the hierarchy, but we can understand from context clues she's doing it to coast. Now, why is this important? Well, how a character is introduced to an audience is the first impression you're going to get for them, and it helps make clear what they struggle with and who they are. If your movie starts with a daydream of 3 people racketing croquet balls into the main character's head, it's pretty clear how she feels about her situation, how you should by proxy feel about it. By starting the narrative with this additional bit of explanation, this shifts Veronica's character from someone who hates her current status into someone who is actively seeking status and privilege to escape her own hang-ups, which I would argue is the exact opposite perception.
Come on, Veronica. You used to have a sense of humor.
The changes continue. When Veronica is asked to write the note humiliating Martha Dunstock, in the musical she's unaware of who the note is for until after it's written.
What are you doing? Please don't do this, okay? Not to Martha.
In the film, she is told directly what Heather intends, and we see the fallout of that happen immediately after to reinforce the effect that Veronica can have. This fallout was changed in the musical to happen at the same time as the party. Subsequently, Veronica's forgery abilities have less importance narratively as a result of this. It's still clear that she's writing the notes, of course, but the underlying point that it doesn't really matter what she's writing because society will eat up anything that is written is obfuscated by the reduction of the petition subplot and the removal of Veronica's dream sequence spelling it all out.
You don't get it, do you? Society nods its head at any horror the American teenager can think to bring upon itself. Nobody's gonna care about exact handwriting.
Let's pin that for later. Veronica's sexual history was changed to be far more clean as well, with her first time being with JD, who she seeks out somehow. In the film, it was JD seeking out her house, which makes a lot more sense than a drunk Veronica. The underlying reason for this change, similar to JD not pulling a gun out in the cafeteria, is to frame JD's actions as being far more misguided rather than malicious. He doesn't seek out Veronica, and his issues with his mother and depression are brought up to the forefront.
When Mom was alive, we lived halfway normal. Now it's just me and my dad. We're normal.
He also doesn't try to sexually assault Veronica twice like he did in the film. So we have a framework here that makes him out to be more innocent, but this is then juxtaposed with removing much of Veronica's responsibility towards the murders, which creates this incredibly strange contrast where JD is both more innocent in this version and more toxic. He'll sing with Veronica and how they should just be 17, but still attempts to blow up the entire school. This becomes an issue once we look at how this affects Veronica. In the film, it's very clear that their relationship is toxic the entire time, and it thus explores the power dynamics between them. The key point of this, I would argue, happens at Kurt and Ram's funeral. Now, at this point in the film, Veronica has started participating in some pretty awful things, such as shooting Kurt and accidentally poisoning Chandler. During this scene, Kurt's father starts crying and says that he doesn't care his son was gay, that he loves him anyway.
How do you think he'd react to a son that had a limp wrist with a pulse?
We're encouraged to laugh along with Veronica and JD over the suffering, and this is where the narrative pulls a clever trick by directly calling this out with Kurt's younger sister noticing this, and having Veronica feel extremely guilty over how she's behaving. By having the audience surrogate be critiqued in this way, it in effect changes the narrative to thus be critiquing how before this point, we didn't care that people were dying, it was all part of the fun. But now, there's truly negative ramifications to these actions, and it leads to Veronica starting to disengage from participating in JD's cycle. In a sense, this beat makes the film, and without it I feel the narrative would be significantly weaker. The musical handles this section by, having Veronica address the horror of what happened to them and confronting JD, before veering into having Kurt and Ram's father secretly being bisexual, with the entire town singing about how they accept their sons as gay while they make out, before then transitioning to JD and Veronica singing about how they should just be 17 instead and making out, Martha Dunstock insisting that Ram was straight because he kissed her in kindergarten, Veronica disconnecting from Martha entirely, another song covering the pep rally Miss Fleming holds, Heather McNamara singing about her issues, Veronica preventing her suicide, before finally culminating in Veronica and JD breaking up after JD accidentally points a gun at her. Part 3. So this section right here is a rather complicated encapsulation of what I think are the core issues of the musical. Since we're dealing with like 3 different plot threads here, we'll tackle these individually first and then I'll explain what could be done. Thread 1 is the changes to Ram and Kurt's funeral. Here I can see what they were going for. I think the creators were aware of the commentary being relayed in this initial beat. They're aware of how popular a line, "I love my dead gay son," is, so they decided to combine the two into a statement against homophobia.
I love my dead gay son.
The problem here is the utilization of a stereotype that homophobic men are secretly just gay or bi men in the closet. While this has been used to great effect to convey hypocrisy in other narratives, here their actions are framed as positive, and we're supposed to ignore the textual evidence added in, reinforcing that these two were abusive towards Kurt and Ram.
Enjoy the party, son.
Punch it.
Now, I can already hear the counter-argument that this hypocrisy is intentional, that the town becoming more accepting than doing like a pep rally for the cameras is supposed to show how fake this is. While this is definitely an intentional element with Miss Fleming's character, I refute this here, and here's why. First, the musical straight up ends with everyone singing about wanting to get along like it's kindergarten again, in contrast to the film ending with Veronica and Martha agreeing to watch some movies. We'll get to that. By having the final song be a rousing crowd number, this reinforces that we really are supposed to take Dead Gay Son, one of many crowd numbers, at face value as a genuine show of people learning to become better in the face of tragedy, using the aforementioned stereotype. Second, well, despite the attempts by the creators, this is missing the point. Notably missing from the musical is this exchange with JD and Veronica, which confirms they're using underlying biases against the town.
Oh, come on. A lot of people drink mineral water. It's come a long way.
Yeah, but this is Ohio. I mean, if you don't have a brewski in your hand, you might as well be wearing a dress.
Does this answer your question?
Oh, man, they were
The bit here is centered around the narrative already knowing that making homophobic remarks is bad, and uses that as a centerpiece for radical change in the main character. Look at how the crowd reacts to what is in the forged suicide note and the dads having a relationship in the musical.
Graham and I died because we had to hide our gay, forbidden love. That's only you and me in the summer of '83.
They're laughing because the narrative is ultimately saying, haha, they're gay, with not enough commentary to challenge that notion. Both things the film acknowledges and refutes, which can't happen because we gotta make a funny song about the dads instead. Moving on to thread 2. In this version, the characters of Betty Finn and Martha Dunstock were compressed together, which seems like a positive change at first until you really look at how this impacts the theming. See, Martha in the original was a silent character deliberately, as she quite literally doesn't have a voice in the community she was part of. She's consistently harassed and bullied by most of the principal cast, and even her attempt at suicide is treated like a joke by Heather Duke.
Just another case of a geek trying to imitate the popular people of the school and failing miserably. Is that pate?
This makes it really impactful when Veronica does give Martha a platform as soon as she becomes the most powerful person in school, as it's only then that Martha is able to speak.
I'd like that.
Now, in fairness, injecting Martha some agency makes sense in terms of just keeping her in the mind of the audience, reinforce her even getting her own song. However, in practice this ends up creating a lot of needless complications. The investigation scene, for instance, is here so Veronica can have a moment where she completely cuts Martha out, thus justifying her apology at the end. The scene doesn't really add anything beyond that, but it had to be incorporated due to them being friends in this adaptation. Speaking of, if Veronica is friends with Martha Dunstock maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago according to the stated timeline,
Dear diary, it's been 3 weeks since I became friends with the Heathers.
and she's treated like one of the popular kids already, then why does it matter if JD has photos of Heather Duke and Martha being friends when they were 6?
Just a tangible reminder that at one point at around age 6, I'm guessing, you and Martha Dunstock were friends.
Bringing back that pin, the answer is that the petition subplot was heavily reduced in this version. In the film, Duke had far more time to be developed, and Dunstock was more obviously the uncool person nobody associates with at all. making it clear that the up-and-coming Duke would be socially ruined if these pictures were released. Having Veronica continually associated with Martha, defend her publicly against the Heathers, and then only pushing her away towards the very end, kinda defeats the whole point of JD threatening Duke to get the petition going. Now, while Veronica does get bullied due to the rumor Rem and Kurt spread about her, she's never shown getting harassed for being near Martha, which feels like a missed opportunity to reinforce the social stigmas that are being deconstructed here. If Martha's gonna be involved in the narrative, having this addressed would be a good idea. Similarly, adding back in the textual evidence that Heather Duke uses bulimia as suppression would reinforce this point further. The musical brings up this issue once in the opening and then drops it, while the film makes a point of showing Duke overcoming this after Heather Chandler dies.
Watch it, Heather, you might be digesting food there.
Yeah, where's your urge to purge? Okay.
This shows that these specific social hierarchies have negative ramifications, and that JD giving Heather that ribbon symbolically represents Duke becoming the person that caused her so much suffering to begin with.
Here's a little gift. From Heather to Heather.
Since the musical changes this scene to be when Duke seizes power, she is never given power by JD or shown to have stopped her bulimic tendencies. They even add in textual evidence reinforcing that she's devoid of personality.
Heather Duke wants the yearbook. No discernible personality, but her mom did pay for implants.
This means we're never really given a reason to care that Heather is becoming another Chandler other than her name being Heather, I suppose. We're thus left with a really weak plot thread that is integral to the ending, but it lacks most of the surrounding details to make it feel natural.
Shut up, Heather. Sorry, Heather.
Alright, and now for thread 3. Having JD and Veronica reiterate they love each other right after Kurt and Ram's funeral was a weak choice in terms of progression. Everything after this is about the fallout of these suicides and how it starts to result in people attempting it for real. This right here should be the moment Veronica and JD start to fall apart. It was in the film, but here they chose to reinforce it, only to then have them fall apart right after anyway. Guess we need to include love songs on the album or it'll never sell. Sorry, that sounded cynical, but I can't see why else they would reinforce a toxic relationship like this if not to get the heartstrings and wallets going. JD is not a troubled bad boy, he's a deconstruction of an archetype that takes the underlying cynicism to a more extreme conclusion.
So maybe I am killing everyone in the school. Because nobody loves me.
Veronica is not really a wacky, relatable girl. She's a deconstruction of a typical teen movie love interest who gets agency beyond who she dates.
Get off of my bed, you fucking psycho. You think you're a rebel? Do you actually think you're a rebel? You're not a rebel. You're fucking psychotic.
You say tomato, I say tomato.
Cleansing these elements to bend them towards being what they're satirizing is missing the point.
I'm not strong like you are.
You got power. Power I didn't think you had.
So, how would I go about fixing most of this? Well, the answer surprisingly is present in Illegal Heathers, the much maligned bootleg version that became a meme in the fandom for its poor quality. While this version is, one thing to note is it actually fixed some problems by just straight up removing Kurt and Ram from the narrative. This in turn completely removes Blue, Dead Gay Son, and Our Love Is God. This makes sense because the musical is not meaningfully critiquing biases or the characters due to how much was changed to fit more stuff in. If you never substantially challenge Veronica for participating in homophobia, it doesn't make sense to have an entire bit where she and JD frame two people as gay. If you never make your audience feel uncomfortable with sexual assault and remove a lot of textual references reinforcing it is wrong, it doesn't make sense to have an entire song about Kurt and Rem's balls being blue. Oh no, I have to say that. Now, suppose your argument is instead to make it more like the film. Well, I think it's worth noting in that regard that the few times I feel the musical actually starts to get to a powerful level of commentary is using its own format. For instance, McNamara is singing about her struggles with depression, before being teared down and almost committing suicide before Veronica stops her.
If I say the wrong thing, or I wear the wrong outfit, they'll throw me right over the side. Oh, look, Heather's going to whine. Oh, mother, you don't deserve to live. Why not kill yourself? Here, have a sedative. Why, oh, there's roses in love. You're pathetic because you want it. You want all that you do, not so hard to. You want it, bitch, you know. You don't deserve to dream.
The sequence is direct, harsh, and the payoff to it actually results in some genuine social commentary and empathy. Similar bits of good critique are here, such as the dead girl walking reprise, where the consequences of these actions are genuinely explored and elevated due to the musical framework. And in terms of whole new additions, the usage of people killed by JD and Veronica as ghosts who haunt over the proceedings allows for a lot of really creative musical sequences and genuinely funny moments. So it leaves the question of why new iterations continue amending the musical of new additions so long after release, and what that implicates. Part 4. Mainstream. Cult films are a contradiction. You would think, considering how many of them are box office failures, they wouldn't therefore be commercially viable, but that's exactly what ends up happening. The Big Lebowski was created by a mainstream movie studio and didn't do that well critically or financially until it was reassessed by a cult audience. Due to this new resurgence in popularity, it's now getting a spin-off film directed by one of the actors who was in it. While this is a positive example of a film being appreciated in a new context, this does have the opposite effect of affecting art in order to appeal to what is now mainstream. Snakes on a Plane was memed quite a lot as soon as its first trailer was released, which caused the studio to order additional scenes be shot for it in order to meet what is expected from that fan base. Most infamously, Samuel Jackson's plane line being derived from fans creating parodies of the trailer and premise. The film was a disappointment to the studio and was essentially discarded right after, with the film itself being unable to be much of anything due to having been morphed into something else. This type of thing has happened to follow-ups to other cult films, such as 2011 Thing's practical effects being painted over in CGI to appeal to what the studio thought would be a larger market. The list goes on. If a cult film achieves any sort of notoriety, odds are it's going to get a follow-up in some form that changes the meaning of the original work to be something closer to the mainstream. Suddenly, it makes a lot more sense why people feel uncomfortable about the original Heathers going back to it. The movie is aggressively critical and nihilistic on how systems in place turn people into monsters, and how tragedy becomes commodified. But this is not because the film is taking uncritical joy in the absurdity of people dying. As Daniel Waters, a screenwriter and soul for the original film, explained in an interview,
"When I say Heathers was written as a response to the teen films, that's correct, but I need more than that to get me to write. The way teenage suicide was presented in films and in the media as a news story incensed me. A teenager who had committed suicide would be elevated to this godlike level. The way the media talks about these issues makes it too real, and suddenly suicide becomes something to consider when you're feeling depressed."
This is why I fundamentally disagree with the musical ending on a happier note than the film, and toning down the violent behavior of JD to make him more likable. What they've done here is commercialize a narrative about nihilism and suffering, and turn most of it into a feel-good rom-com that is afraid to go there and challenge its audience in ways the original did, and still does. We're currently in a situation where brands are appropriating depression and suicidal ideation in order to promote, such as Sunny D's gimmick in early February. We're unironically creating Teenage Suicide Don't Do It, which isn't in the musical despite being one of the only songs with lyrics in the film.
Teenage suicide, don't do it, teenage.
That's it. We're breaking up.
What?
I don't think the creators of Heathers the Musical were trying to be harmful. In fact, in interviews, it's clear that they have reverence for the original film like I do and had reasoning behind their changes, which I've linked in the description and would recommend reading. However, it's also undeniable that this version of the story is highly profitable, in contrast to the original not breaking even and the TV show being pulled and edited in the wake of multiple school shootings. So maybe what people are looking for is escapism that helps them through a really dark time. This, I feel intentionally or not, is the philosophy of Heathers the Musical. If there's any takeaway I would like from this video, it's that art is never created in a vacuum. Art is created under social circumstances, and those circumstances can impact how a text is interpreted culturally and personally. You've lived a different life than me, so maybe you'll find value in this work that I've missed. You're not wrong if you do. Please don't tell me to review the TV series.